Okay, I'm going to talk of our church life, which involved most of our, how should I say, was what we looked forward to all week because you really didn't get to town. I'm talking here of the early 30s. And I think on Sundays we always did our morning chores and then you had to hurry through. You had different washcloths, you had different towels put out on Sunday. And of course, the curling irons. These were heated. We used a kerosene stove. My mother liked this wavy look, and so this was used on her hair, and this my sister and I used this to make curls. You heated them, and then you clamped them into a newspaper so that burned first rather than burn your hair. And what we didn't, I think we hadn't heard of the word humidity, but by the time we went to church, a lot of times our curls had straightened out, so that was the bad thing. We went to church 8.5 miles south of Wishick, what we call the Rural Danzig Baptist Church. The cemetery is still there and is being maintained by the church. And in the wintertime, we went with the sled, which I have a replica here. My brother would go earlier, and probably an hour and a half earlier, and try to start a fire to heat the church. But the church wasn't warm until noon, and then of course it was time to go home. In the spring, when the roads were underwater, we went with a trailer, which was basically a car frame with a wagon box on it. And we only did that about 2 Sundays because that's how long it took for the water to go down. All the services were in German, and this kind of lesson was used. These are still from the 70s, but earlier they were used by everyone. It was German and English. And Sunday school classes were all in German except for the small children. You were given 2 pennies, one for church and one for Sunday school. And the services and the classes were held in German, and of course the men sat on one side and the women and children on the other side. In 1938, we started coming to church in Wishick, which is the church here. Earlier, it was just a basement church, which was used for 13 years until this church was built. We wanted to be the first ones married in the new church, but the building took longer to complete, and in other words, we were the last couple married in the basement church. We went to country school, and every child had their syrup bucket as a lunch pail. The lunches were probably homemade bread with syrup on it, which was soaked through by noon, and a slice of sausage from the night before. And at home, you never threw away an extra lid, because you used these buckets for carrying water and for carrying milk, but you saved all the extra covers because your school lunch pail got treated pretty rough. And it was one teacher for all 8 grades, and we sat in desks like this here. And the water cooler was like this here, and the water was carried in from farms a half mile or 3/4 a mile away. A lot of times it was not very clean. And when we walked home at night, it was not quite 2 miles. Then we would quick change clothes and walk out to the field, and in the fall we would help pick corn until it got dark. And later on, when the crops and the things got better, we also picked potatoes because you had about a wagon load of potatoes in the fall, which you shared with many others. And one thing about the country school was where I went to, you had to buy your own books. And you were always watching for someone who was going to be 1st, 2nd, or 3rd grade, so you could buy their reading book, which you paid 25 or 35 cents for. I was about a 4th grader when they bought books for the whole school. There was no encyclopedias for the for anyone. There was no literature when you got to be a 7th and 8th grader, when you should have had civics and literature and extra history books. There just weren't any. Of the reading books in the entire school, I would guess there probably were 6, 7, or 8 books to read. There just wasn't anything, and you missed it. You just had to make do with what was there, and the teachers did the best that they could. You actually learned from one another. The first graders, if they were listening on 2nd or 3rd grade arithmetic, so be it. If there was an 8th grader who couldn't read very well, was listening in on the 1st and 2nd graders read, so maybe they did learn from one another. I've always, to this very day, I like to read, and I still have that ache for not having enough books. My oldest recollection of my brother is night after night he'd be paging and paging through a Sears Roebuck catalog, because it was the same in your homes. You had no magazines or anything, and you just missed it. And many, many years later, even in a beauty shop, I would find myself idly turning pages in a magazine, getting back to the advertisements in the last pages and reading them before I would catch myself and think, I don't have to read advertisements. I have other things to read. So that is my thought of school. Of course, there was the outhouses that were used. There was baseball games. Very few of the kids owned a ball or a bat. And in the wintertime, you played fox and the geese. And ante-over is where you threw a ball over the coal shed and caught them as they came around the building. It's the only 3 games that I can really feature. Baseball game never ever finished because your recess wasn't long enough, and so you just played until the bell rang. Okay, that's about it.
What school did you go to?
We went to Albright's Valley. Every school district had 4 schools, and so you were just you were one of 4. And once every 2-3 years, they gave shots out in the school, and then you had a half a day off where they would load all the children from all the schools together and take them to one school where a doctor gave shots. So
how many students were in each school when you were going to school?
Right around 20, 22. I know when my oldest brother started school, there was 30, 32. And if kids didn't pass their grade, they sometimes went till they were 17 or 18, and they were in the 6th grade. In my age level, not too many kids quit school, but on the age level of my oldest brother and sister, most kids quit school at the 6th grade. Mostly to work. There was no, not saying that they were not doing well in school, but they quit because they had to work.
Were the kids ever held out to work on the farm and then they would come back to school?
Not really. I think for that reason there was only 7 months of school was that they could work in the fields in March. The school ended the 15th of March. So then they could help with the farm work. The fall, I really can't remember if there was any kids missing. School started about the 5th or 10th of September. I can't remember if there was kids missing for that reason. So.
Was the makeup of the school largely German-Russian, or was it a mixed group of students?
No, they were all. There was, again, maybe not so much on my age level, that kids came to school without speaking one word of English. My oldest brother, on that age level, very few of the kids spoke any English. Sadly enough, when my children went to school here in Wishick in the late 60s, they would occasionally get a student that didn't speak a word of English. This is a very German-Russian area. We make funny jokes if we know a Norwegian in the area.
Were you guys allowed to speak German when you were at school, or?
They didn't really say. I don't remember whether we spoke. I think we spoke English outside. I don't remember.
And then the other question I had, because you were talking about books, was do you remember any of the books that you read when you were a kid, the ones that you were able to get your hands on?
There was one that was Evangeline. That was listed under literature, and that was poetry. And then Uncle Tom's Cabin, that one was there. That was, I bet you I read each one of those 20 times or more. And those two I remember by title, but other than that, I still say there was only about 6, maybe 8 books to read. So.
Okay.
There really were no toys when I was little. I don't know if children got toys for Christmas or birthdays. I rather think they don't. But the mothers would take the spools, they sewed everything, they patched everything, so there was lots of spools, wooden spools, and they tied them together. This was not used as a necklace. This was a girl's toy. If there was a little boy in the family, they stacked these like blocks, and they rolled them like wheels and stuff. So there wasn't much in toys. And in outside toys, I don't know if you've ever heard of boys and girls just pushing tires. Just an old tire that was way beyond being used was just rolled. If you had a real good knack for it, you could use a stick for rolling a tire. If you didn't roll it very fast, and you used your hand, and that was a form of play. It was rather unusual, but as far as toys, I remember I got a little chair that a relative had made. I think they paid 75 cents for it. I was maybe 4 or 5 at the time. And at that time, all the apple boxes were wood, fairly good, no, I shouldn't say good wood, but large pieces. And my brother took the pattern and made some of these little chairs, and he tried selling them for 75 cents, but people didn't have 75 cents, you know, so I have no recollection of my sister or brothers of getting Christmas gifts or birthday gifts. Those were very hard times, and it wasn't just our family. I mean, this was everyone. In the later 30s, then, you know, when things changed, like 39, 40 or so, of course, then it changed. But for the holidays, of course, there were cookies were made, holiday cookies and so, but you used what you had. And one thing that you had was eggs. Everybody ate lots of angel food cake because you beat the egg whites. You had the eggs. And the yolks were saved to make homemade noodles. Nothing went to waste. The shells were crumbled and either fed back to the chickens or placed in the garden. There's nothing wasted. This quilt is one of my earliest memories of my mother sewing. They never, ever had enough money to finish a quilt or enough material. This was in the very early 30s. And during the day, it was passed at school that a neighbor woman was going to have a quilting party. And so when evening came, all of us, the entire family, went with a sled to the neighbor's farm. But before we left, she found a little paper bag. We always called them a candy sack because you could get 5 cents worth of candy in a sack like that at the store. And she was just frantic looking for pieces of material to put in there. And after we got to the neighbor's house, and the ladies had quilted probably about 2 hours or more, and then each one would pull out their little sack and would exchange quilt pieces. That gave them a different color or a different type of material for their quilt. And the next morning, this is the wedding ring pattern. As you notice, the pieces are very small. The next morning, I was very little, and I was sitting on the floor by the sewing machine, and she cut her 5 little pieces to add onto her quilt. And she was so happy. She was singing. And I've thought so many times since then, we have so much. When did we ever sing for joy over 5 little pieces of material? She made several quilts 2 or more in the wedding ring pattern, 1 in the Lone Star. That was very nice. She made up her own pattern for it. And trying to think, the Southern Doll pattern, she made several of those. So that when we got married, we each had 1 quilt or more. The better quilt was given as a wedding gift, and some of the others were just given to us to use. And she had a satin quilt that she made that was royal blue on one side and gold on the other side. And she wanted it to be so nice, she didn't allow anyone else to quilt with her on that. She just wanted her own stitching. She made a lot of things. Here again is some of the feed sack items. These are pillowcases that are made from feed sacks. This was chicken feed that they bought, most likely for the baby chicks in the spring, because they never bought any chicken feed for the older hens. This is a feed sack apron. It's never been used. This was made for my hope chest before I was getting married. I don't recall whether we made blouses or anything of it, but sometimes the sacks were not very nice. This is one of my mother's aprons. This is also a feed sack one. And an apron that is really, really old was one that my sister-in-law made probably about 1930 or so. And the white material is just a flour sack, which your sheets were all made of flour sacks. They sewed 4 flour sacks together, and presto, you had a sheet. You sewed 1 flour sack together, and you had a pillowcase. This is a rice bag. Now, these bags were more flimsy. This size was also used for, you could buy salt and sometimes sugar, but most people bought sugar in 100-pound bags. These were rather flimsy, and the women actually liked them. This is what they strained their cottage cheese through. And they would tie it together or put a string across the top and tie it onto a faucet or somewhere, and it would drip dry until your cheese was very dry after. You never threw anything away. These were also used for storing things. My mother did a lot of crocheting and a lot of sewing. She crocheted this for me when I was probably 12, 14. Not enough you actually pinned it onto your dress. She made the exact same one, the same color, when my daughter was 12. So she has one too. One thing that I mentioned during the education portion, that I finished school when I was 11. I had heard the term graduation present, graduation gift. I didn't know what it was, but I wanted one. And so I kept talking and talking about a graduation gift. My mother and my oldest brother ordered it from Sears. They got 28 pieces to embroider for 98 cents. I embroidered these dresser scarves when I was 12. There was many other doily type pieces, and my mother crocheted the edging on, but I did the embroidery when I was 12. These items here, I don't know if you can do a close-up here. These items here, this is a round tablecloth, and so is this one. My mother made for her hope chest probably about 100 years ago. We have not figured out, I've showed this to many people, we have not figured out how they did this stitching. They refer to something about they wrapped the thread around the needle many, many times until they got the length of that. I don't know, I have no idea. This here is also something from my mother made before she was married. This here she made before she was married. This is a type of linen. I have no idea where they got linen from. My mother did refer to peddlers that it was like your Walmart or Kmart on wheels. These peddlers came and they had cloth and they had thread and crochet thread, embroidery thread, different items that they had on their buggy. And they were very poor and very starved. And she said the grandparents always asked them in to eat. And one time, you know, the homes were not big, maybe 3 or 4 rooms at that time. One time she said one of the brothers came out. They asked the peddler to stay overnight. So he slept somewhere on the floor with her brothers. And one of the brothers came out and whispered to Grandma that this peddler's underwear were just shredded. And so she said, tell him to drop the underwear outside the door. And she stayed up most of the night with a little flimsy kerosene light and patched his underwear for him. And in the morning he was very, very grateful to get back underwear that weren't shredded. And I'm sure she patched it with used material because there was no new material 100 years ago. So that was one thing. Another thing, my mother made her own wedding dress. We've been told it was white with brocaded flowers on it. She had it a few years. She tried to save it, but when my oldest sister came along, she took it apart and made a dress for her when she was a few years old. But at the other hand, she sewed her own dress for her golden wedding anniversary, and this is it. It seems kind of scratchy with the glitter. It's a little different than today's glittered materials, but it's about the same. I don't know, we covered some with church, but I want to show you this picture. They had church conferences for which there was a large tent set. Now these are just the working people that are on here. And the women would get up like at 3 in the morning and butcher a bunch of chickens and haul them into town, and they'd feed like 800, sometimes 1,000 people. They got about 25, 35 cents per meal. My parents are on this picture here. They had a camera that was wheeled by. And so you notice the old Wishick School here has no square corners. You look carefully at the windows and the walls, there's no corners, which I guess was the result of being wheeled by. Now I want to show you another example. We're not sure whether one was 1920 and 129, but this one here, and we actually knew this man here on the end. The camera was wheeled by slowly. These houses are still here in southern Wishick. Mind you, this man standing here holding his hat is kneeling over here and holding his hat. You try and explain that to a photographer. As the camera was slowly wheeled by, he ducked and walked past the crowd and got on the picture again. I could name him, but then I probably shouldn't. He's not living anymore, but it was interesting. One of these is labeled 1920 and the other one 1929, that one with the women working. We're not quite sure whether they were the same year or whether one is mislabeled. This one here is from Lair. Again, we estimate about 1931. I've looked very, very hard on there. And let's see, I have to find it where there's a little girl here. On this one here is my grandparents and my aunt and her little girl. I figured this one is from about 1931, judging by the girl's size. So there was many different things in our life. Oh, I was going to show you some of the crocheted goods here that my mother made. She made lots of this, and this is what was called the pineapple pattern. This was for the armrests, and of course they had to be pinned on or they wouldn't have stayed in place. The matching piece for the backrest was either round like this one is. This is also used as a centerpiece on a table. or a half a piece was used on the backrest, pinned on, of course. But here was one that she made way back in the 1930s. Very fine thread. And a woman, an older woman from our church had made one. And my mother said, well, can I borrow yours that I can copy it? She said, no, you can do it the same way I did. Gave her a little scrap of newspaper, probably 1 inch by 2 inches. And they tried counting how many stitches it would make to make a square. And this is what it came out with. I've often been amazed. I mean, the older women were so good in sharing. But this older woman said, you can count the stitches the same way I did. And she counted and counted and counted, and that's what she came up with. Actually, it's also for the end of a chair like this. I don't recall that there was matching armrests to it, but here's another one. This kind of crocheting was done in little circles. They made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Some women would make a bedspread that took them anything from 3 to 6 years to finish. They had to make hundreds of them. They used them for dresser scarves, for piano covers, for tablecloths. They were quite, the only thread they could get was this ecru color. I think that's what they called it. And later on, there was a thread that came out that had a yellowish tint. I did get hold of a bedspread that I gave to my daughter that has this yellowish tint to it. It's huge. Must have taken someone years and years to make it. And they were so surprised when white thread came out, white crochet thread. I mean, they were just beaming. That was like a miracle to them. And then, of course, they started all over again making these pieces in white. This one here tells you how people lived in the 1930s. This one was evidently burned probably in an oven or near an oven. But this one here with the big burn on it was definitely burned on the back of a coal stove, because you can tell with the burn. I heard the story many times before I finally bought one. A rolling pin with only one handle on it. And I saw this at rummage sales, flea markets. Like I said, I heard the story over and over again. It was always the same. The rolling pin fell off the table and one handle broke. But they could not afford a new rolling pin, so they learned how to use it with one hand and roll the side. It was the same story over and over again, and now I actually have several that only have one handle. You wouldn't believe how many I have that have one black handle and one red handle, so you know they were patching their own. Probably, there's one out there, I can't pull it out without collapsing the rest. It's made out of a fence post. So that tells you the poverty that people lived under. Two of the most unusual ones I found in Washington about 2 years ago have carvings of Indians on there. It's very, very good carving, probably outlined with wood burning because you got the brown lines in there. So those are very unusual, although I consider most of them unusual.
How many rolling pins did you have when you were growing up?
One.
And how many do you have today?
1,496, and I'm still looking.